Really, verse 4 begins the sovereign movements of the divine amid the order and the framework of the material and natural world. There was nothing really that we would say was so miraculous about this in the sense that it was a turning of water into wine. But all of a sudden, these men found themselves in the throes of a huge storm, which the New Testament calls a Euroclydon. Just the ship was about to be broken up. The waves and the wind were so fierce. You know, I get nervous when I hear about mariners being afraid. For these were men of the sea, but that's what it says here in verse 5. Then the mariners were afraid, and every man cried out to his God, and threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten the load. We don't see Jonah on the scene here, just the mariners fighting against what they have no idea has happened to them. All of a sudden they're in the throes of this incredible storm. But God is behind it. And there's a prophet on board. Well, what do? They do two things that I think are common to men of this world. The first thing they do is every man cried out to his God. In calamity, men are religious, aren't they? You know, even in trouble, we ought to call upon God. God expects us to. He wants us to. He desires us to. But it's just somewhat instinctive that men know that they ought to call upon God when they're in trouble. Something that God has put in us to seek something outside ourselves when distress comes. And Jonah expresses the truth about the fact that we need to call on the right God. For he says in chapter 2 and verse 8, those who regard worthless idols forsake their own mercy. To call upon a false God is to ask the true God to turn a deaf ear. And these men had nothing else to do but to call on the only God they knew. Secondly, they threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten the load. This came also, I think, instinctively. They got rid of the heavy stuff so that the boat would be more buoyant in the waves. When you think about it, this cargo that they were carrying was important. It was probably the very purpose for their trip. And yet now, with their lives at stake, they cast it out of the boat. It meant nothing to them. There are lessons here to learn because we hold on to things so tightly sometimes, and yet our lives are at stake. Well, they get rid of the stuff in the ship. Things sometimes are too precious, but they realize that it was either them or the stuff. They got rid of the stuff. Well, amid all this distress, we do see the prophet in verse 5. It says, but Jonah had gone down into the lowest parts of the ship, had lain down, and was fast asleep. He was in trouble, and he didn't even know it. You ever been there? In trouble and not even know it. Men in this world are in that position. But here it's the prophet. And he's not aroused here out of his slumber by the word of the Lord. He's not aroused by the wind and the waves, the howling outside, but really by an incredulous rebuke of the ship's captain. What do you mean, sleeper? What are you doing sleeping at a time like this? Well, it does remind us of our Lord Jesus Christ, doesn't it? He was asleep on a pillow, and the waves and the wind were high on the Sea of Galilee. And the disciples came and said, Don't you care that we're perishing, Master? And he gets up and rebukes the wind and the waves. But Jonah is sleeping, taking his rest. He wakes up with a start, and he's given this piece of advice, or is called upon to do this. What do you mean, O sleeper? Call now upon your God. Maybe your God will think upon us. And how necessary that was, because he was the only God who could think upon them with kindness and mercy and deliver them. The gods that all the other men were to call on would do no good. And amid the calamity and the emergency that was upon them all, ship, captain, and crew, Jonah had slept. Well, if Jonah illustrates a man who tries to run from God's presence, and you see that phrase occur several times here. He went away from the presence of the Lord. Away from the presence of the Lord. And when he talked to the man, he said he went away from the presence of the Lord, as if anyone could.